Thank you for coming today. My name is Jill Baker-Gower, and I am a faculty member in the art program here. I teach jewelry and metalsmithing, and I am chair of the Visiting Artists Committee. The Visiting Artists Series is a collaboration between the Cleve Carney Museum of Art and the programs of art, architecture, photography, and interior design. Our next lecture will be in March, so look out next year for the announcements about that spring series. As a reminder, we encourage the audience to silence your phones and stay for the entire lecture if possible. At the end of the talk, we should have a couple minutes to take a few questions. Now to introduce our visiting artist, Gracelee Lawerence. Gracelee's work explores relationships between food, the body, and technology, residing in the intersection of physical and digital reality. Their art examines how bodies are gendered and fragmented through capitalist desires, physical sustenance, and digital spaces. Gracelee has participated in 20 residencies globally and had her second solo show at Postmasters New York in June 2022, praised by Roberta Smith in the New York Times. Currently, she is head of sculpture area at the University of Albany, SUNY. Recent exhibitions include the Peter Gagey, Prior Art Space, and Kavi Gupta. Gracelee has installed outdoor sculptures at locations such as Wave Hill and Franconia Sculpture Park. She was a visiting professor at Chiang Mai University on a Luce Scholars Fellowship and are a member of the collective Material Girls. Beyond art, Gracelee is an avid dancer, lifelong equestrian, and dedicated gardener. Welcome, Gracelee.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. I so appreciate it. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this a reasonable microphone level? All right, super. I'm so pleased to be here. I already had some really wonderful interactions with students yesterday and other faculty, and I'm really happy to be here to share my enthusiasm for sculpture with you. So to set the stage of my work, I'm going to begin with poetics. And I often approach the systems and structures of my work laterally, so a poetic approach lays the foundation that supports the finished product. And instead of a linear view, this allows for a kind of cross-pollination and elasticity of ideas that I find really useful. And so, with those foundations laid, let's begin. These are not living bodies or fruits ripening only to bruise and rot. They are fictive appendages and globular organic structures. Fingernails are not growing, sap is not running. They are mirrors of my experience, abstractions of relationships mediated by digital space, of how I perceive the world quickening in its technological progressions and its emotional effect. And they're ruled by touch, my own touch, their boundaries to one another, propped and screwed and glued and sanded, print touching print, chemical touching surface, and of course, I touch it all. And within my process, there are, of course, ironies of pressing the soft, oozing, messy nature of bodies and plants through the harsh and unyielding geometries of digital space. Even if you cannot see the hundreds of thousands of triangles that make up an object, they're present, always slightly shifting the underpinnings of the form. Their varied densities interact and curl in and out of each other in seamless unions. But this translation to the geometric makes for a skew, a flattening, a smoothing. Digital life is always cleaner than our corporeal mess. And as we all know, in life there's always more lurking just beneath the surface. Just as nothing is exactly as it seems, nothing is unsoiled. But regardless of what lies beneath, how can logical science, the invariable coordinates of the Cartesian grid, lend truth to raw emotion? There is no pure sensation. Everything is tainted by context, experience. These are things to hold sensation translated into object form, or perhaps more aptly, mirrors with a different kind of refraction. And while boundaries of the grid hold the forms in the orthogonal, conditions and connections of the physical world create an entangled web of sense memories. So in my spaces, Boundaries are merged. A banana turns into a finger, my body is a vegetal mass, asparagus fingertips across the gallery. The biocyborgs emerge in their fragmented and bulbous forms. But underneath, they're still regulated by these geometries and their inflexible rules. But you may be wondering, how can an object hold sensation? And I answer that through touch and translation, data gain and loss, the erosion and addition of zeros and ones. On the left, I'm holding myself, scanned and archived, made into a file. I can email myself. On the right, Rachel holds copper fingers while Cameron takes a picture, flattening the dimensionality and responsiveness to screen space, while I did the same thing a few inches further back. But back to the context of these objects. You feel this thing differently if you've eaten a banana, if you've felt the clammy peel in your hand so much like human skin, equally delicate and prone to showing marks of its age and movements in the world. If you've peeled back the leaves of a cabbage like the petals of a flower, cupped your hand around the warmth of another person. These are all little mirrors. And a mirror reflects and refracts oneself, creating an image of who we think we are. There's, of course, an exhibitionism inherent in our moment of digital proliferation, this constant need to measure one's digital refraction. But how does this change desire? How does it shift fear and fantasy? And not to mention that eggplants will never be the same again. And of course, neither will my work. These things are sexless as dead things, and yet they're filled with gender. There is a historical link to sexual desire in art making. If you just look at those modernist guys, Picasso, Matisse, Monet, their abstract expressionist descendants like de Kooning and Pollock, and while I certainly do not look to these men for guidance in art or life, they are historically a part of the foundation of contemporary art that I must observe. Gender and power are obsessively present in their work, and this directionality of the desire, in the case of those examples, is a clear male to female linearity. But I want to cut up that idea, sever those lines, tangle them, twist or joke or confuse these historicized binaries. But sex or desire, that's too simple. Erotics feels more apt. The erotic has often been misnamed by men and used against women, says Audre Lorde in Uses of the Erotic. It has been made into the confused, the trivial, the psychotic, a plasticized sensation. The notion of the erotic implies the uncontrollable draw of our bodies to something larger, being in relation, calling the inner life into play. And a part of this interest, the use of the word erotic, stems from the historically masculine traditions that I'm working to squeeze out of existence and a desire to make a softer world. And in the process, I often find myself thinking about the embryonic, translucent resin suspended in a gelatinous mass, a vat of resin, slowly, prints coming into the world layer by layer. The process of removal feels delicate, or perhaps even tender, and once the surrounding material has been scraped away, it's the first time that the encased object has ever existed in our own dimensional world. And at first, this removal is done with great care. But soon the newness wears off. I begin to touch them like a person I know, with a material intimacy that grows over time. I'm less afraid, more brusque. No longer timid, I think I know the boundaries. And in boundaries, there is still a relationship to the shell, the egg, simultaneously a protective barrier and a vessel. But more than that, a mirror, going back to the context talk from earlier. And while the excavation is embryonic, the gestation is anything but organic. Linear, Cartesian, layer by layer, built with toxic chemicals and UV light, thermoplastics and heat. But still, it is making solids from liquids. And in that, there is an unlikeliness to some of these objects, a hole that they fill in my sculptor brain. Not easily cast or hand-carved, their translucence and delicacy makes them feel like tiny organs or jewels, but also ghosts, which makes sense, as I often think of 3D scans as ghosts. But these ghosts, they manage to become real in a physical sense, invading more than just screen space. They're forced through several more translations, from a scattered point cloud of information to triangles to a line code read by a 3D printer, and then, of course, extruded into the world with varying degrees of accuracy. And once they arrive, liberated from their digital sterility, they're subject to the aggressions of touch, dust, holding, pretending, feeling, breaking, sticking, smoothing, longing, polishing, caring, aching, caressing, breaking, building, cracking, aging, etc. All of these actions that we ourselves cannot escape. And there's also some kind of excavationist and additive mothering in this messiness. I'm forcing my own will, along with gravity's relentlessness, onto these digitally conceived forms that honestly are pretty often materially unequipped to exist. They're ill-prepared, so I prop and glue and screw and sand and press to fortify them. But above all others, the form that I continually capture is my own body, again and again, scan and archive to try to know myself better, or perhaps to capture different facets. I tear myself apart and put myself back together again. And here are two scans of the same arm, 5 years apart. But are they the same? That depends on your conception of the digital and your definition of real. In digital space, time can expand or contract or even circle back around onto itself in the same way that identity can be expanded or exploded or completely shrouded, allowing a person to become someone else. Space can be amplified or extended to become unknowably vast or compressed so that the entire universe fits onto a pinhead. What is real or fake is unimportant. All of those realities coexist on our physical plane and are merely amplified by the possibilities and downfalls of digital space. And from time to time, we are faced with the inevitability of the physical realm. Things like bodily disease or extreme weather make us feel as though our digital selves are inert or impotent or inadequate. Digital space is still considered by most people to be a place of escape. And this is a really sticky thought. The average American spends over 7 hours a day staring at a screen, and probably at this point much more. It's become both completely normalized and quotidian while still operating in the space of neoteric exception, which is a notable and perhaps concerning combination. And while digital space is certainly not a novelty at this point, it's treated much more like a distraction than what it really is, which is a place where we travel to, if only with our eyes and minds. In my work, I'm asking, can we embody digitalness? Can our bodies withstand the torsion of translation? Can we truly step into the mirage with our eyes open? So, with the poetic context laid, I'm going to switch gears into production, which is a more linear progression, but with really good reason. The shifts in my work are a continual evolution, with each exploration building from the last, as is true with many artists. And so, as you've already figured out, my work is born in this transfigurative space between physical and digital reality. I'm thinking about these potential fluidities between destructive dualisms like masculine, feminine, nature, culture, human, animal, digital, analog. And so I'm going to start with work from 2015. And this was the first time in my work that I responded to place and context. This was a site-specific set of pieces that I made at the Umlaut Sculpture Garden, a museum in Austin, Texas. And in this work, I was really actively disrupting the overtly masculine and patriarchal traditionalist stance of Charles Umlauf's bronze figurative sculptures in the museum's garden. You can see to the top left of this photo is one of Charles Umlauf's pieces that I was responding to and my piece in the foreground. So Charles Umlauf, who's the namesake of the museum, was a sculpture professor at UT Austin, where I attended grad school. So each one of my pieces was placed in proximity to his work that it was responding to. I was pushing against his heteronormative, hierarchical, stereotypical presentation of bodies. And I also co-opted his titles for my fountains, further linking this revisionist intention. And this was the first project also where I used digital fabrication. So I started using image rather than material as the base metaphor of my work. Prior to this point, I had been using food materials like flour, salt, pineapple crowns, juicer pulp, just to name a few, as the base materials of my work. And so digital fabrication allowed me to scale the work to previously impossible extremes, and also think about the accessibility of image in a public setting. And fruit first entered the work as a material interest, Because of this linguistic and image-based reciprocation with the body and also its intrinsic humor, fruit is used to understand the size of a tumor or a growing fetus. Bananas are constantly invoked in phallic jokes. The peach emoji, great example. So there's this really active reciprocation around language, bodies, and plants. And in bodies and plants, to some extent, they're both pruned, grafted, sculpted. They both ripen and decay. And I started making these fountains as a perhaps strange replication of nature, borrowed from the waterfall, the stream, the oasis. Related to ideas of leisure or regeneration, fruits and fountains are both also linked to pleasure and abundance. But beyond that, the fountains give the objects a job, a title beyond sculpture, elemental actions that I can't fully control. If you've ever tried to make a fountain before, you'll know what I mean. This fountain is called Eve's Stack. There's a misting pump as well as water running down from the top of the pear. So the basin of the sculpture fills up with this kind of mist that rolls over the edge, has a cauldron-like appearance. And in this work was the first time that I began using scans of the body, at this point both from my own body and also from people in my community. And over time, this has morphed into the creation of a huge 3D scan and 3D object archive. It kind of charts my path through the world with these digital impressions. And in the center of that particular exhibition, that was actually my thesis exhibition, was a fountain based off a Charles Umlauf sculpture of the same name that was also installed in that same courtyard originally. In A Woman Looking at Men, Looking at Women, Siri Husvet said, "The history of art is full of women lying around naked for erotic consumption by men. These women are mostly unthreatening, aren't they?" Well, this is a double-ended pineapple. She has two little spiky crowns. She's got a fat roll. Seemingly she's peeing herself while she's on this lounge chair. There's water kind of coming out between the pineapple and the lounge chair. So I really wanted to bring into question the consumable nature of bodies and fruits. And I'll also share with you my first fruit fact of this presentation. Don't worry, there will be more. In 17th century Europe, a pineapple from the Americas was super rare. It was worth more than its weight in gold. And now, of course, they're available in just about any grocery store for a few dollars. So this is a really wonderful example of how the histories of fruits and really any ingestible item and their relationship with colonialism, distribution, and the control of bodies, spaces, and resources are a really important point of research in my process. And also understanding our global commodities market. And just as another example, my fountain on top and Umlauf's original bronze below. So directly after grad school, I received the Luce Scholars Fellowship, and I moved to Chiang Mai, Thailand for a year and a half, where I assisted the artist Arai Rasmirjansuk and also taught in the Contemporary Art Practice Department at Chiang Mai University. And I began to think about technology, particularly the role of digital fabrication in my work, very differently. Technology became my primary means of connection, support, and care, while in a new place so far removed from my previous community. And so I wanted to capture this translation of emotion and empathy through technology, through digital space. So I began to use the tools available, a 3D scanner and a 3D printer. That was it. Those I brought with me, and my department didn't even have a drill. So those were the tools at hand. To play with this idea of pressing emotion from physical to digital space and back again. And digital fabrication very quickly became more than just a means to an end. And this was my setup while I was in Chiang Mai with this little tiny horrible 3D scanner, my laptop, and my printer. So everything I was doing was kind of based on that trifecta at the time. And this work was not only dealing with my shifting relationship to technology, but also how my identity was shifting and changing from immersion in this new sociocultural space. My boundaries were shifting as I tried to understand the expectations of being a young professor, a woman, a white American, and much more while living in Thailand and also learning the language. And these pieces were in 2 shows during my time in Thailand, and when I left, the show in Bangkok was still up, and I have no idea where they are now. No idea at all. I like to imagine them maybe in a stranger's home or forgotten in an alley. Maybe they're still at the gallery, but I like to imagine they're still out there doing their work. And when I returned in the summer of 2018, I did a residency at Mary Sky, which is a beautiful property in the Green Mountains of Vermont. And I made this incredibly site-specific piece. My proposal was chosen in the inaugural year of their initiative to commission a site-specific installation or sculpture from one artist each summer, which they have recently re-upped, which is great if you're a person who is interested in spending some time in Vermont and making an object that lives outside. Mary Sky is a wonderful place to look at. So I spent 2 completely solitary weeks on the property, perhaps the most wonderful 2 weeks of my existence at that time, and left with plans for building this object, which is a world without genesis. And this is a gravity flow fountain situated on a copper vein and stream that ran down the mountainside property. And there are a couple of important details to note. The right breast is a tangelo, and the left nipple is a Phillips head screw. Her right arm is turning into a pile of rocks. The copper hand on the left is slowly holding a bronze banana finger. The right leg turns into a horse leg, and there's water dripping down the chain. So in many ways, this fountain became an accidental self-portrait, which is something I've never intended to do, even though I often use my own body as a part of the scanning process. I brought 2 important texts to the mountain. Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, an absolute classic. If you don't know it, you should. And Banana, A Global History, another great book I highly recommend. If you are a banana enthusiast, you have to know. So another quick produce fact for you. Bananas are actually an herb. They're not a tree. Surprise. And they're categorized as an herbaceous perennial. They're actually distantly related to ginger. So don't ever call it a banana tree again. Call that an herbaceous perennial. Important information to have. So there's a real cyborgian quality to this object. There's like a truncation, rearrangement, replacement of human parts with mechanical components. That's the definition of a cyborg. But at this moment, I started thinking about biocyborgism. And this is an idea that I've been developing over the course of the past 5 or 6 years. And so instead of replacing parts and pieces with mechanical components, I'm thinking about using parts and pieces of the natural world to continue this exploration of the rift between nature, culture, biology, technology, animal, human. And the purpose of this object is to be connected to the stream itself, with the gravity flow and the patina of the copper and bronze components, with the environmental exposure of that particular place. She's headless, as some kind of attempt to remove intellect and ego, plus also an important nod to fragmented classical statuary. And this is a video of the installed sculpture. You can see that there's just a very, very, very gentle flow of the water from the 3 output areas. And this was really intentional with the gravity flow nature. So this sculpture was placed deep in the woods of very rural Vermont. There was no way that I could use solar power. There was no power on site. And so I made this 2-basin system where, depending on the natural flow of the stream, the output of water on the sculpture would be different. So very much in direct response to the landscape. And I'll give you one more important banana fact. Bunches of bananas are actually colloquially called hands, and a single banana is called a finger, which I didn't even know after I started making this sculpture. But isn't that nice that sometimes things float down to your brain in multiple different ways? This is a preparatory scan of the site using photogrammetry. I love the glitchiness of 3D scans. I love the way that data can be kind of improperly spread across this piece of digital information. And so that's something that I'm really currently exploring in my work, even more than ever before. And I'll just kind of breeze over these indoor fountains, but this is the first time I used a virtual reality sculpting app, which is something I do quite a bit now. And I was very much thinking about goddess mythology, images of the nursing Madonna. The central torso is surrounded by these vessels and stylized food items, and then the mouth on top is like drooling over the entire scene. And water is running down through the central torso into this little cup that's just continually overflowing as the fountain runs. And this is the companion to the previous fountain. This is Sensation Without Feeling. I made this at the Visible Futures Lab during a residency at the School of Visual Arts in New York in 2018. And for the first time, I was using 3D printed resin components, of which I extolled the material virtues of earlier, which is a really exciting kind of next step in understanding how digital fabrication, and particularly 3D printing, could be folded into my work with new material qualities. This is fountain Ancient Hormonal Soup. And often I'm using these fountains as a place to experiment with new materials and processes that don't feel like they have to be quite as tied to the otherwise pretty tight continuity in the rest of my work. So this etched acrylic plate acts as a kind of splash guard for the water droplets and condensation to collect and drip back into the basin. And it also has a misting pump, so fog is slowly rolling over the rim of the fountain. It becomes a kind of sci-fi fantasy object in color and material, a future techno cauldron. And that leads really well into this piece. This is Eventual Artifact. This was a collaboration with my dear friend and fellow sculptor, Deborah Freelander. And this was actually located in Times Square as a part of the Spring Break Art Fair, Times Square Immersive in March 2019. It lived in Times Square for 1 whole month and survived, which is kind of a miracle. And we thought of this piece as a fantasy core sample of a Times Square from the future. So the fluorescent strata are interspersed with 3D printed copper forms of imported fruits and hands, CDs, sneakers, styrofoam cups, other techno-capitalist artifacts. And the sculpture is intended to explore society's relationship to globalized capitalism through a personal and geological lens. And actually, the cap of this column is a 3D scan of a topographic sample of Manhattan bedrock in Central Park, which is a scan that I did with Deborah in Central Park. And the emerging hand is holding a phone, and there's only a mountain emoji on the phone. So it's really important that we scanned the Manhattan bedrock because bedrock is what allows skyscrapers to be built in certain parts of the city, including Midtown. So the landscape of New York, the geology of New York, completely interconnects with the way that we understand the functionality of the city. And that's so true in many, many places. So that was supposed to be an important kind of reference, a nod to the way that geology has a much stronger hold on us than we perhaps suspect. And there's also a little bit of digital humor. There just had to be. This is a solo show of mine, Finger Width, from May 2019, and the title of the show refers to the optimal moment of which to pick asparagus. So talking about both the exhibition central sculpture and also the inherent relationships between body and food and the language that we use to understand them. It also references one of the rules I use to make my work. There is no area smaller than the finger width on these objects. If you're a sculptor that's ever had to sand a lot of things by hand, you know why. And so these were described as beguilingly creepy and charmingly perverse in a review in The New Yorker, which I felt was a perfect description of my intention. And this is a double-ended pomegranate, has a kind of obscene belly button, pooch that's being squeezed by 2 fingers. They have jagged nails. And in this body of work, I started to think of these forms as biocyborg vessels of a particular emotional state. So this object is really uncertain, anxious, beleaguered, in direct opposition to this piece. This pair of asparagus stalks starting through the gallery, perfect square nails, epitome of confidence, internalized success, externalized presence. And also, these pieces are very much in relationship to perceived happiness as the ultimate revenge, which is the largest piece I've ever made. From summer 2019, I was at Franconia Sculpture Park as a Jerome Fellow, and I learned how to build a 21 by 18 foot concrete basin, essentially all by hand, which was a wildly intense experience. The park didn't have a tractor, so it took a huge team of people to make this happen, of whom I am still very grateful for. And this piece is this larger-than-life biocyborg female form morphing into a bunch of celery. So from the waist up, she's kind of shifting into a celery form, and her body is flattened onto this concrete pedestal in the center of a large oval basin. And she's also kind of hunched around a creased pillow. It looks like maybe she just woke up. And there's this intention of grief, uncertainty, vulnerability, intimacy, belly down. She's well below eye level, so you have to crouch down to peer through the twisting stems and leaves, which is a really intentional aspect of this piece. And water is coming out of 16 stalks. She's kind of crying relentlessly into the basin. And 2 stalks are also branched off of the central core. It's supposed to be like arms that are spread and flung out with elbows wide. She has also this really luminescent pale lilac color that modulates with the light of the sun. Important note about this color, it's actually a Mazda stock color. Any of you could go to an auto body shop and get anything you want, including your car, painted this color. I wish my car was this color, gotta say. But it's just wonderful to know that the Mazda paint samples are so expansive. How nice. But this sculpture is frozen in this moment of tension. It has this kind of wilting listlessness and confused radiation of Bestrun sexuality, and I really wanted that dichotomy to be present within this piece. And very happily, this gal gets to go to the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum for a year-long outdoor exhibition that actually opens next week. So in her next iteration of life, she actually is waterless. She will not be a fountain, but instead a static form. This is a render of the object in Rhino during the planning phase, just to give you a little behind the scenes of what digital studio might look like. And in relationship to that piece, this is provisional body. This was installed in May 2020 at the Museum of Museums in Seattle, Washington. And this is very much a revision of the Greek myth of Daphne and Apollo. So Daphne is, in fact, turning into a celery instead of a tree. And I was very much interested in shifting my relationship to surface finishing. I mean, as a sculptor, thinking about surface and color and the relationship of the external component of a sculpture is an incredibly important aspect. And so underneath all of my painted forms, there is this modeled underlayment of epoxy putty. And so for the first time, I was exposing that layer. It makes almost this camouflagey pattern. And that has become a really important moment of shift in thinking about surfacing. And that also led into this piece. This is Other Escapes, the ones you can open in yourself, exploring the relationship between the body and propagated plants and technology, connections between humans and the natural world, and also the socio-political history of gardens in general. I love this particular plant that it's referencing, the angel trumpet flower, Brugmansia. It's drooping towards this basin of water. It's also referencing Narcissus. The tail that comes out of her butt is resembling a plant stem. So Brugmansia, a beautiful plant, is also incredibly deadly. The angel trumpet flower and Datura, which is the what is it called? Devil something flower. They're like in the same family, but one is facing up and one is facing down, is a really important plant because it is often used as an ornamental, but it's a hallucinogen as well. So its presence in a garden brings in questions of agency and control, particularly thinking about the traditionally female-coded space of a flower garden and how an ornamental actually could also perhaps give one opportunities or capacity to change the way your brain is behaving. So this is a 3D printed maquette of that piece, which is a really important way for me to understand the form before I end up working on this large-scale final object. That's something that I'm often doing now in my work because, printing the smaller form is much speedier than producing the entire large-scale form. And this is a really important step of the process because it's quite difficult to know what a piece will look like, what it will feel like only in digital space. A rendering is a really important and useful phase, but understanding it in physical terms is incredibly important as well. And also for the past several years, I've been producing small 3D printed objects. People order them directly from me as a way to mitigate this extreme inaccessibility of the art world. So these are kind of lower cost 3D printed versions of my work. And the intention of this is that people are able to bring the work into their spaces rather than fully be reliant on institutions to experience sculpture. As I often discuss with my artist friends, we can't afford our own large-scale work. So in this way, ideas are able to move throughout the world without that inhibition of institution or extreme cost. So this is a newer series of work. Beginning with a 3D scan, I am processing this form to really encourage these cavernous cutouts and voids. And I'm really interested in ceding some control to the programs. I'm able to respond with really interesting and surprising results to the way that programs are actually interpreting and shifting the data. This is a piece that has 45 individually 3D printed forms and has completely shifted my approach to making larger scale work. I use primarily PLA filament. I'll talk about that in just a second, but there's a wide range of potential texture, transparency options. This piece is really unabashedly present with its digital origins, which is incredibly important in my work. I'm thinking a lot about patchwork quilts and checkerboard patterns and linoleum floor tiles. And this series has become increasingly more involved and complex. This is over 100 components that make up this lower body that's overlaid with fruits and vegetables. There's eggplants, jalapenos, sugar apples, a strategically placed strawberry, a phallic okra, so many more inlaid surprises within this piece. And so much of this series is about play with materials. I'm really interested in pushing the filament to new and complicated stretches, especially because the primary use of much of this filament is to hobbyists, so I'm using it in ways that's not necessarily designed to be used. I am particularly fond of this combination of form and filament. It feels like an oil spill or a dark rainbow, a rotting log, a bowing lichen. And this form actually produced a citrus-like texture that arose unbidden in processing this 3D scan, and that completely changed the way that I dealt with this scan. I had a different idea of the end product of this piece, but I was really interested in responding to the program and the nature of that processing. And so then it became a prompt in content and color instead. And there's a parallel series to this work, digitally derived pedestals for the large-scale versions of the smaller 3D printed objects. And the crowning objects on top are finished with an auto pearl paint finish, which is referencing digital space and the unlikely refraction of light that often arises in renderings, which is something that I think quite a bit about. When I'm making pedestal forms or shelf forms, anything that's designed as something to hold up part of a sculpture, I'm really thinking about expanding on a key gesture in the object. You can see the knotted pear in the back left of that image on the right. There is this sort of knot in the center of that pedestal. In this piece, the peach has hand marks on the side, so the pedestal is kind of mimicking this pleating and gathering of fabric with two hands. So I'm wanting to take this key gesture and then push it down through the structure that's holding up the object. This is a VR sculpting screenshot. These are potential pedestals for that 1D corn sculpture in direct reference to PLA, which is the filament that all of my work is made of. And PLA is a bioplastic. It's made from fermented plant starches, most commonly corn because of the glut of GMO corn in our country. And it's one of the most commonly used materials in 3D printing applications, thermoplastic 3D printing, that is. Also food packaging and plastic bags. If you've ever gotten a bioplastic eating implement, fork, spoon, whatever, it's made of PLA. And while it's a super promising alternative to traditional petroleum-based plastics, it's also still plastic. It's not a perfect solution. And polylactic acid has a really slow rate of biodegradability. It takes 3 months in an environmentally controlled industrial-grade composting environment at 150 degrees, or between 100 and 1,000 years in a landfill to decompose. So in no way is this a short-term material. It just has a different set of terms. And it can't really mix with other plastics in recycling. So it has some drawbacks and specificities. And I'm particularly thinking about with this piece, and honestly in general in my work, the effects of the agriculture-industrial complex and GMO corn on the American landscape. I grew up on a producing farm in North Carolina, and so the agriculture-industrial complex is incredibly close to home for me. And this corn is one single piece of printed PLA plastic. It's very much in clear conversation with Holbein's or anamorphic skull and the Spanish artist Jaume Fuenza's large-scale skewed body forms in this 1D scaled form. So this is the first outdoor bead piece that I made, lack of permanent connection. And I was interested in seeing if I could translate some of these digital spaces into direct image. So this has a wild amount of individually strung glass beads, over 56,000. And it began as a VR sculpted environment that I imported into Rhino, a different program to manipulate. So there's this faceless falling green figure sit on a background of loopy VR flowers. And this was very much an inversion of my normal process. So using digital means to create an object fully predicated on my own physical labor. A coder friend of mine who works for the New York Times and is a genius made a site for me that breaks down the image into line information, how to string each line of beads. And one thing that I love about these materials is that the image disappears when it doesn't have an opaque form behind it. So it shifts with the orientation of the viewer, and it acts like a pixelated mirage. So the data actually becomes digital in this funny way. The object is made from the same materials as computing systems, aluminum, silica, steel, etc., further linking the systems together. I'll just go quickly through these last few pieces. This was Fruit Soup, a two-person show with Audrey Flack's photographic prints. And as I was mentioning earlier, it's also the case with these wall pieces that have shelves that each of the shelves is related to a gesture in the form that's then being kind of pulled out and reproduced with a virtual reality sculpting program. And the rotating tabletop form has also been very iterative. This was from Art Dubai in March 2022. These 5 rotating sculptures are kind of bite-sized versions of the tabletop piece from that gallery. And the objects in this series have a lateral color change, meaning that the color completely shifts from the front to the back of the object. So the tabletop objects turn. They have this kind of cake-like presentation, like a cake presentation from a diner, a preview of a 3D file, a jewelry display, an NFT perhaps. And they're highlighting the reflective and refractive aspects of the material. So thinking about the relationship to digitally rendered surfaces, these objects are also all PLA printed, and part of my intention with these pieces was to complicate what happens when my work is photographed. Often people ask whether an image is physical or digital, and if they are uncertain, then that line has really been properly blurred. Also something that I intended to do with these pieces at this particular art fair, because we were in the digital section of the art fair, was make a physical NFT as a joke on an NFT, as something that was kind of like pushing against that structural situation. And this was also the most recent iteration from my 2022 show at Postmasters Gallery. Some other views within that show. And Roberta Smith of the New York Times described the show as the plastic sublime, and her final line was, "Take that, Jeff Koons." So I feel like I must be doing something right. This is an installation shot from another show that year at Peter Gaugy in Vienna, and I started thinking about how to use resin prints in a new and different way, and I started making these pieces that are wall objects. They feel like little shields. They kind of have a relationship to a body scale. And the title of this exhibition was Collected Trot, a reference to the practice that I spent the first 20 years of my life dedicated, which was horseback riding. This is one of my favorite pieces from the show, a cyborg arm sprouting garlic scapes instead of wires. And this is a series of fruit slices turned into flowers. It was at the art fair, Plural in Montreal. And this was a really important set of thoughts because flowers, of course, contain the reproductive parts of the plant. They allow pollination to take place, so there's an inversion of the potential pollination and fertilization of a plant becoming, of a fruit and a flower, turning that process inside out. A few more newer rotators from this year. These will also be at the Aldrich Museum just in a few weeks. And something else that's very new this year is a collaboration with Alphonse Maitre-Pierre, who's a Parisian fashion designer. This was from Paris Fashion Week in February of this year. And we worked together to design these forms, which was a really interesting combination of sculptural wearable forms, couture clothing, and actually the motion of the models as they walked, which was a really new and exciting way for me to think about object making. So in the case of this piece, It is a flexible filament, so as the model is walking, all of these flowers that are surrounding their head are moving, kind of bouncing back and forth around. So utilizing the kinetic motion and energy that's coming from the model's body and then translating that into the sculptural forms. This is a piece, just the quickest little video ever. This was a piece that was recently in the September 2024 show with him. I made this 3D printed rubber iMac form with an embedded tablet in the front that also has a video that I made that's kind of moving around in a VR environment. This is a new iteration of thinking about a rotator, but more of a disco ball form, more of a hanging from the ceiling rather than being tied to the floor, that I then have shifted into a different set of logic. This is a show from Charleston, South Carolina from this year, just closed a couple weeks ago. And I was very much thinking about how to combine the resin prints, the 3D prints. I'm also thinking about refraction in a more physical context. All of these have refractive crystals all over them because I really wanted to respond to light in the space and how light is bounced around the space, and also to shift image and digital understanding of these objects and the ground that they live on. So I started making this series of wallpaper forms that are all created from screenshots and asset gathering from my digital workspace, and then the sculptures live on those forms. There's much more, of course, cooking in the studio right now, so keep an eye out for all of those things. But just really quickly, I want to share with you my inputs, which is essentially what feeds my brain to make this work, a question that I'm often asked. And I have to say, careful observation is my primary mode of research. My garden and my yard are really important. I'm also just looking carefully everywhere I go. I noticed some really beautiful, gigantic hostas outside of this building, actually, that I'm definitely going to be thinking about for a while. But I'm particularly fascinated by frogs right now. I think frogs are just wonderful, strange, little alien creatures. And of course, reading. Reading is a hugely important aspect of my research. Fiction and short stories are particularly relevant to my practice, and I also am constantly reading about the histories of produce and edible items. I mentioned the banana book. You see the corn book up there. They're by the Reaction. It's by Reaction Press. It's the Edible series. Wonderful series of books. If you have any particular interest in a particular food item or piece of produce, I highly recommend you check that out because they probably have a whole book about it. And then I'm also often thinking about fashion and music. These are a couple of different designers that I'm often looking at, a musician, because I feel like sometimes I'm interested in looking at how other people are using the context of the definition of their practice and then how ideas can press within those spaces. So, for example, my show at Postmasters, I was really thinking about, like, how can I make a show that feels like Dorian Electra's music? And I like having those prompts for myself as I'm making and thinking about how my work can behave in the world. And very, very last, I want to mention Material Girls, which is the collective that I'm a part of. It's a flexible, non-hierarchical collective dedicated to building community and fostering collaboration, opening up space through responsive programming. We facilitate exhibitions, educational initiatives. We offer free resources. We love sharing tools. I would love to dive deeper into the work we've done together, but I'll have to save that for another time. These are two images of an exhibition that we opened actually 1 year ago at James Madison University in Virginia, and our most recent project was a residency at Storm King Art Center in August of this year. So with that, thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I know it is 2 o'clock and some of you have classes to get to, so we're kind of out of time for a lot of questions. And if you do need to get up and leave, that is understandable. But any questions? Yes. You? Yes.
In your early works, you did a lot of fountains, was there any particular reason, any inspirations for those specifically, or do you just like making fountains?
I love to make fountains. I wish I could make fountains all the time, but they're very fussy, complicated things. They're always misbehaving, which is one of their absolute assets, but downfalls. And often spaces don't love to show fountains because they are a little bit of a liability. They're always dripping and splashing and causing problems. But like I said, just very briefly in the talk, I really like that a fountain has this separate definition from sculpture. It's adjacent and related, but it also is a little bit outside. And it has a purpose. It has this kind of inbuilt systemic functionality that's not only a sculptural functionality. So having this expanded definition of something as a sculpture and a fountain, its objectness gets shifted a little bit, which is something that I'm really excited about. And I think often public work can do that in slightly different ways, but a fountain gives this new definition to a work that I am really excited about. I would love to make more fountains, but I also have learned that site-specific context is perhaps the best and most effective way for me to make a fountain rather than a standalone object.
It was the beginning of your talk when you recited your poem. Is that your artist statement?
You know, that is in relationship to my artist statement, but it's something else. It's more of like, it needs to be live. It can't really be translated into another form. I've tried to make it into a written text. I've tried to make it into a video. It just doesn't really work. I need to be responding to those images and ideas in real time, even though it's something that's very planned. I really do see it as more of an active, performative understanding of my work, and not something that would work very well separate from me somehow. But it does operate like a statement, just in a more performative context.
Whoa. I was really interested in your exploration of corn, GMO corn and starches. I also come from like a farming background, and that's something that I think about a lot. Are you planning on exploring with that idea more?
With corn specifically, or just thinking about like farming practices?
I guess both.
Yeah.
Because you talked about like the medium itself being made of it.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
has so much potential, I feel like.
Completely. I mean, it's something I've been thinking about for many, many years, the nature of this material, and it has underlined the importance of using this specific material in my work, because it's so bizarre. I mean, because of the glut of GMO corn that we make, we've basically globally had to figure out what to do with it. You know, we're like, the heck, we have all of this corn now, and we've got to figure out something to do with it because we can't eat it, so let's do something else. So basically what's happening is we have this huge amount of GMO corn. It's being shipped to China, being processed into filament, shipped back to the US, and then sold to 3D printing enthusiasts, which is a wild and really inefficient system. So I'm constantly kind of assessing my relationship to that system, but right now using that material and being present critically with how that material behaves is a super important part of how my work is and kind of exists. And I am also quite often thinking about my own personal history. I mean, my parents live on the farm where I grew up, still being actively farmed. You know, like this is a place that's really meaningful to me, but also has kind of like consequences and relationships to our food supply chain, and trying to understand my relationship to that. I mean, one way that I've handled that is I have my own gardening practice that's been a way for me to kind of like mitigate and shift away from that larger scale farming relationship to my own personal nutrition. But it's something that I'm just continually assessing and trying to understand in relationship to my practice and my objects.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I think we are all out of time. Sorry if we didn't get your question, but thank you again for coming, and thank you, Gracelee. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, y'all. Really appreciate it.